A ship was found drifting in the Atlantic, with dinner still on board, but every person had vanished. A family boarded this ship expecting a normal voyage, and then disappeared without leaving a body behind. The ship was still floating, the cargo was still there, and the people were gone. Imagine you are sailing through the Atlantic Ocean in 1872. The water is restless, the wind is sharp, and up ahead, you spot a ship drifting strangely across the waves. At first, it looks like any other vessel fighting its way through open water. But then you notice something is wrong. No one is steering it. No one is standing on deck. No one answers when you call out. So the crew of a nearby ship boards it, and what they find is even stranger. The cargo is still there. The personal belongings are still there. There is food and water on board. The ship is damaged, yes, but it is not sinking. And yet, every single person who had been traveling on that ship is gone. The captain, his wife, their young daughter, the crew, all vanished. No bodies, no clear sign of violence, no final explanation. Just an empty ship drifting across the Atlantic, carrying one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history. This is the story of the Mary Celeste. And more than 150 years later, people are still asking the same question. What could make an entire group of people abandon a ship that was still floating? Welcome back to Echoes and Oddities. I'm Ivy Monroe, and here we follow the strange, the forgotten, and the stories history never fully explained. Today, we're looking at 3 real mysteries that sound almost too strange to be true. A ghost ship found with no crew. A plane that vanished after sending one final message no one could understand. And another vessel discovered floating in the Pacific, with every person on board missing. But first, we will begin in the Atlantic Ocean, in December of 1872, with a ship that should have been full of life. Instead, it was found completely abandoned. Mystery number 3. The Mary Celeste. Few mysteries have captured people's imagination quite like this one. For more than 150 years, the Mary Celeste has been remembered as one of the most chilling ghost ship stories in history. Because this was not a ship that sank without a trace, it was found, still floating, still carrying cargo, still holding many of the everyday signs of life. And yet, the people on board were gone. No bodies were found, no clear signs of a violent struggle were discovered, and no one has ever been able to say for sure what happened in those final moments before the ship was abandoned. Over the years, the Mary Celeste has inspired countless theories, from mutiny and piracy to panic, natural disaster, and even the supernatural. But at the heart of it all is one simple, deeply unsettling question. Why would an entire group of people leave a ship that was still afloat? To understand why this mystery still fascinates people today, we have to go back to December of 1872, when another ship spotted the Mary Celeste drifting alone in the Atlantic. On December 5, 1872, a British ship called the Dei Gratia was sailing through the Atlantic Ocean near the Azores Islands. The weather was not especially violent, and at first, it seemed like an ordinary day at sea. Then, the crew noticed a ship in the distance. It was the Mary Celeste. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about seeing another vessel out on the water. But as the Dei Gratia drew closer, something immediately felt wrong. The Mary Celeste was moving strangely. It seemed unsteady. Its sails were set in an odd way, and perhaps most disturbing of all, no one appeared to be on deck. That was strange enough to raise concern. A ship at sea should have shown signs of life. Someone should have been steering. Someone should have answered a signal. Someone should have been visible. But the Mary Celeste drifted on in eerie silence. So a small boarding party from the Dei Gratia was sent over to investigate. What they found only deepened the mystery. The Mary Celeste was completely abandoned. There was no captain, no crew, no passengers, no sign of the people who had been on board just days before. And this was not an empty cargo vessel. The people missing included Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their young daughter Sophia, and the ship's crew. They had all vanished. But the strangest part was this: the ship was still afloat. It had not been destroyed. It had not been burned. It had not been ripped apart by some catastrophic event. There was some water in the hold, but not enough to explain a total evacuation. The cargo was still on board. Food and drinking water were still there. Many personal belongings had also been left behind. This was not the scene of a ship that had clearly gone down in chaos. Instead, it looked as though the people on board had left and never returned. One important clue did stand out. The ship's lifeboat was missing. That suggested the captain, his family, and the crew may have left the Mary Celeste intentionally. But if they did, why? And what could have possibly convinced everyone on board to abandon a ship that still seemed capable of staying afloat? That question is what turned the Mary Celeste into one of history's most famous maritime mysteries. Because the ship was there, the evidence was there, but the people were gone. And what investigators found next would only create even more questions. Once investigators and sailors began looking more closely at the Mary Celeste, the mystery only became stranger. Because while the ship had clearly been abandoned, it did not look like the scene of some violent disaster. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no bloodshed, no bodies, and no clear evidence that pirates had stormed the ship and taken everyone by force. In fact, some of the ship's most valuable cargo was still there. The Mary Celeste had been carrying a large shipment of industrial alcohol, and much of it remained on board. There was also still food and drinking water left on the ship, enough to suggest that the people on board had not been preparing for a desperate final moment. Many of their personal belongings were still there too. That detail has always made this case feel even more unsettling. If the captain, his family, and the crew had left in a hurry, it seemed they had done so without taking everything they would have needed to survive. Still, there were a few clues that suggested something had gone wrong. The lifeboat was missing, which strongly suggested the people on board had left the Mary Celeste intentionally. Some of the ship's gear was also missing, including important navigational items. And there was some water in the hold, though not nearly enough to explain why a seaworthy ship would be abandoned completely. That is where the theories begin. One of the most widely accepted ideas is that Captain Benjamin Briggs may have feared an explosion. Because the ship's cargo included barrels of alcohol, some historians believe fumes may have leaked from the cargo hold. If Briggs smelled those fumes, or feared a spark could ignite them, he may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily, planning to stay close to the ship until the danger passed. Another theory is that the crew believed the ship was taking on too much water. If the pump was malfunctioning, or if the captain thought the flooding below deck was worse than it really was, he may have decided to evacuate before it was too late. There are also theories involving rough weather, a sudden sea event, or even a kind of panic caused by the unpredictable conditions of the Atlantic. But some theories seem much less likely. Piracy has long been suggested, yet the cargo and valuables were still there. Mutiny is another possibility people have raised, but there is very little hard evidence to support it. And of course, because this case is so eerie, the Mary Celeste has also inspired more dramatic explanations. Everything from sea monsters to supernatural forces. But the truth is, the most frightening answer may be the simplest one. That in a moment of fear, perhaps because of fumes, bad weather, or the belief that the ship was no longer safe, the people on board made a decision to leave. And once they stepped away from the Mary Celeste, they may never have had a chance to get back. That is what makes this mystery so haunting. The ship survived. The evidence survived. But the people did not. And more than a century later, no one can say with certainty exactly what made them abandon a ship that still had every chance of staying afloat. And as strange as the Mary Celeste was, it would not be the only mystery on this list where people vanished and left behind more questions than answers. Mystery number 2. Stardust. If the Mary Celeste is one of history's most famous ghost ship mysteries, then Stardust is one of aviation's strangest disappearances. Because this was not just a plane that crashed. For decades, it was a plane that seemed to vanish into thin air. And what made the mystery even stranger was the final message it sent before disappearing. One word that still has never been fully explained. On August 2, 1947, a British South American Airways plane called Stardust took off from Buenos Aires, Argentina, bound for Santiago, Chile. This was the final leg of a longer journey, and to reach Santiago, the aircraft had to cross the Andes Mountains. That alone made the flight dangerous. The Andes were beautiful, but they were also unpredictable. The weather could shift quickly, the clouds could hide the peaks, and for pilots in the 1940s, crossing that mountain range was not something to take lightly. But at first, the flight seemed routine. The crew sent position reports along the way, updating their location, altitude, and estimated arrival time. Everything seemed normal. The plane was expected to reach Santiago at 5:45 in the evening. Then, just 4 minutes before it was supposed to arrive, a message came through. It said, ETA Santiago 17:45 hours, STENDEC. The radio operator in Santiago heard the message loud and clear, but the final word made no sense to him. STENDEC. He asked the plane to repeat it, and the same word came back again. STENDEC. Then again, STENDEC. And after that, silence. No more radio contact, no landing, no answer from the plane. Stardust was supposed to arrive in Santiago within minutes. Instead, it disappeared somewhere over the Andes with 11 people on board. No wreckage was found. No survivors appeared. And for years, no one could explain what had happened. All they had was the flight path, the mountains, and one strange final word that seemed to hang in the air long after the plane was gone. STENDEC. That final message helped turn Stardust from a tragic aviation accident into one of the most haunting mysteries of the 20th century. And what happened next would only make the story even stranger. After Stardust vanished, search teams began looking for the missing plane almost immediately. But the Andes are vast, harsh, and unforgiving. If a plane went down there, it could disappear into snow, ice, rock, and clouds so completely that it might as well have vanished from the earth. And that, for years, is exactly what seemed to happen. No wreckage was found, no survivors were discovered, no clear explanation came quickly. The search went on, but the mountains gave nothing back. And because there were so few answers, the mystery only grew. People began to wonder what had happened in those final minutes. Had the crew become disoriented while crossing the Andes? Had bad weather hidden the peaks from view? Had the plane encountered powerful winds or dangerous icing? Or did that final word, STENDEC, mean something more than anyone realized? That word became the heart of the mystery. Over the years, people offered every explanation imaginable. Some believed it might have been a coded distress message. Others thought it could have been a mistake, a scrambled word, or a message sent under stress. One popular theory was that it was meant to be descent, but somehow came through incorrectly. Others believed it may have been misunderstood in Morse code altogether. But even as theories piled up, one thing remained true. No one knew for certain. And because the plane itself had not been found, the story of Stardust remained suspended in mystery for more than 50 years. Then, decades later, the mountain finally gave up part of its secret. Wreckage from stardust began to emerge from the ice high in the Andes. The long-lost plane had not disappeared into thin air after all. It had crashed into the mountains. That discovery helped solve part of the mystery, but not all of it. The most widely accepted explanation today is that the crew likely believed they had already cleared the Andes and began descending too soon. In reality, they were still dangerously close to the mountains. Cloud cover, severe weather, and powerful winds may have made their position harder to judge than they realized. Instead of flying safely past the peaks, stardust appears to have struck the mountainside and then been buried under snow and ice, hidden for decades by the glacier. So in one sense, the mystery was solved. The plane had not been sabotaged. It had not vanished into another world. And it had not simply disappeared without a trace. It had crashed, and the mountain kept it hidden. But one haunting question still remains. Why did the crew send the word STENDEC? Was it a mistake? A misread signal? A rushed transmission? Or was it something the crew understood in that moment, but no one else ever would? That is what keeps Stardust so fascinating. The plane was eventually found. The likely cause became clearer. But its final message still lingers like an echo from the clouds. A single strange word, repeated into the radio. And then, silence. STENDEC. And while Stardust disappeared into the mountains, the final mystery on this list would leave behind another abandoned vessel, and another set of questions no one could fully answer. Mystery number 1. The Joyita ghost ship. If the Mary Celeste was the ghost ship of the Atlantic, then the Joyita became one of the South Pacific's strangest maritime mysteries. Because unlike a ship that simply vanished forever, the Joyita came back. It was found, still afloat, still drifting, but everyone on board was gone. In October of 1955, the motor vessel Joyita left Apia, Samoa, heading toward the Tokelau Islands. It was supposed to be a fairly ordinary trip across the South Pacific. The vessel was carrying passengers, crew, and cargo, and if all had gone normally, it should have arrived not long after setting out. But the Joyita never reached its destination. At first, there may have been hope that the ship had simply been delayed. The sea could be unpredictable, and travel between islands was not always simple. But as more time passed, concern began to grow. Something was clearly wrong. Search efforts began, but the Pacific is vast. A ship could be swallowed by distance, weather, and open water so completely that finding it again could feel almost impossible. Then, more than a month after the Joyita had disappeared, the mystery took a chilling turn. The ship was finally found, drifting in the ocean. But what made the discovery so eerie was not just that the Joyita had been lost. It was the condition in which it was found. The vessel was damaged. It was partially flooded, and it was leaning badly to one side. It looked like a ship that had been through something serious, but it was still afloat, and there was no one on board. No captain, no crew, no passengers. All 25 people who had been traveling on the Joyita were gone. The ship had not sunk beneath the sea. It had not disappeared without leaving any trace behind. Instead, it had been discovered, like a ghostly shell of itself, drifting through the Pacific with no clear explanation for where everyone had gone. And just like the Mary Celeste, that was what made the case so deeply unsettling. Because when a ship sinks, people understand the tragedy. But when a ship survives, and the people don't, the questions become much harder to answer. What could have happened on board? Why had the Joyita been abandoned? And if the people had left the ship, what made them believe that leaving it was their best chance of survival? Those questions would only grow more haunting once investigators got a closer look at the vessel itself. Because the clues found aboard the Joyita did not tell one simple story. They only made the mystery deeper. When investigators examined the Joyita more closely, the ship only became more mysterious. Because the vessel had clearly been through trouble. It was damaged, it had taken on water, and one of its engines was no longer working properly. There were also signs that the ship's radio may not have been able to send a clear distress call over a long distance. So it was obvious that something had gone wrong. But what made the case so strange was this. Even in that condition, the Joyita was still considered difficult to sink. The ship had enough built-in buoyancy that many believed it should have stayed afloat, even if it was badly damaged. In other words, the Joyita may have looked frightening, but it may not have been as hopeless as the people on board believed. And that changes everything. Because if the ship was still capable of floating, then why did everyone leave? One clue suggested they may have abandoned it on purpose. Several emergency items were missing, including at least one of the ship's smaller boats. That made it seem likely that the passengers and crew had left the Joyita rather than simply disappearing from it. But if they did leave, they would have stepped away from a vessel that, despite its damage, was still floating. That is what makes this story so haunting. The most widely accepted theory is that the people on board believed the Joyita was in far more danger than it actually was. Maybe the flooding looked worse than it really was. Maybe the loss of one engine, combined with the ship leaning to one side, made everyone panic. Maybe they feared the vessel was about to sink and believed their only chance was to leave in a smaller boat or raft. If that happened, then the tragedy may have come after the abandonment. Out on the open Pacific, a small boat would have been far more vulnerable than the Joyita itself. Wind, waves, exposure, and distance could have turned a desperate decision into a fatal one. Other theories have also been suggested. Some people believed there may have been violence on board. Others wondered if the crew had made serious mistakes, or if someone had been injured and the situation spiraled out of control. There were even suspicions of foul play. But just like with the Mary Celeste, no single theory has ever answered every question. What we are left with is a deeply unsettling possibility: that the people on board the Joyita may have abandoned the one thing most likely to keep them alive, and once they did, the ocean took them. That is why the Joyita remains such a chilling mystery. The ship was found, the clues were found, but the people were never seen again. And that leaves behind the same haunting question that sits at the heart of so many maritime mysteries. Was leaving the ship a desperate act of survival, or the fatal mistake that sealed everyone's fate? 3 mysteries. 1 ghost ship found drifting in the Atlantic. 1 plane that vanished into the Andes after sending a final message no one could explain. And 1 damaged vessel found floating in the Pacific, with every person on board gone. The Mary Celeste, Stardust, and the Joyita all left behind different clues, different theories, and different kinds of unanswered questions. But they all have one thing in common. Something happened in those final moments that made people disappear, and history still cannot fully explain it. So now I want to know what you think. Which mystery is the strangest to you? Do you think these were tragic accidents, moments of panic, or is there still something missing from the story? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy strange history, unsolved mysteries, and real stories that still feel impossible to explain, make sure you check out the Echoes and Oddities podcast playlist. I post new stories every week, so subscribe and come back for the next one. Until then, I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is the Echoes and Oddities podcast.